AP Environmental Science with Miss Haskins, feeding the world. We don't always say free-range fishery, we say more sustainable fishing. In the interest of creating a supporting sustainable fishery, many countries around the world, they've developed fishery management plans. And this often is a cooperative between one another. International cooperation is particularly important because fish migrate across national borders, and some of them migrate through ecosystems. And this all spans national boundaries, and many of the world's countries rely on fisheries. So the Northwestern Atlantic fisheries, for example, is comprised of several continental shelf ecosystems that stretch from northeastern the United States all the way to the southeastern part of Canada. Historically, these fisheries were among the most productive in the world. However, overfishing and international fleets of these factory ships have basically led to a catastrophic depletion of the fish stock that is there, particularly of cod and pollock, which you like to hear about because everything is made of pollock in the grocery store. By the early 1990s, this fishery had basically collapsed. So they were forced to close these fisheries because of all these depleted stocks. And Canada and the U.S. governments imposed a law on the bottom fishing area. So basically, the majority of the Atlantic Canadian fisheries closed, and they're actually still closed today. Most fisheries in the United States are now back open, at least part of the year. So in response to this fishery collapse that happened, in order to restore these depleted stocks and manage the ecosystem properly, U.S. Congress passed the Sustainable Fisheries Act in 1996. And this act shifted fishery management from a focus on an economic sustainability to a more sustainability of a species approach. And so this act calls for production of critical marine habitats, which are important to not only commercial fish species, but also like the non-targeted species, everyone else who's swimming around in there. Many of these commercial species are considered to be endangered, like cod, for one. So a sustainable fishery means that no fishing will be permitted until the populations pretty much recover. In 1973, fisheries managers introduced a system of individual transferable quotas, ITQs. That's a fisheries management program in which individual fishermen, are given a total allowable catch of fish for a particular season. They're allotted to catch so many fish and sell so many fish in that particular season. Now, and up front, this is going to sound just like any other type of like you need a fishing license to go fishing, and you can only buy so many deer tags, you can only kill so many deer per year. But how this works is actually a little bit more complicated. In short, before the start of each salmon season, for instance, fishery managers establish a total allowable catch, and they distribute it across quotas of individual fishermen and fishermen companies. So they basically know who's going to fish, and they're allowing them a certain amount. All right, so let's just say these fishers with these ITQs, they have a secure right to catch their quota so that they have no need to spend money on bigger boats and better equipment in order to outcompete others. If the fisher cannot catch enough salmon to remain of any economically viable, then they can sell or not give away, but sell off their part of the ITQs and still make money. So since the beginning of these ITQs program, the salmon population and the harvesting have all increased. So at times it varies a little rapidly, but the cost of fishing has drastically been reduced. And in Alaska, these ITQs are sold primarily to small, like family-run fish operations. And in New Zealand, the ITQs are oftentimes being controlled. They're using them to control this overfishing, and also trying to lessen these large fishing type of companies. So it's twofold. It's a protection of the wildlife area, and it's also a protection of business ownership. Aquaculture. The demand for fish has increased even as wild fish catch have been failing. So, in response, scientists and government officials and entrepreneurs alike have been developing ways to increase the production of seafood. We call this aquaculture. This is the farming of aquatic organisms like fish, shellfish, and even seaweeds, I think, are included in it. Aquaculture involves construction of an aquatic ecosystem by stocking it with organisms, feeding them, protecting them from not only death but disease and predators. And this usually requires, keeping them in like an enclosure. So it may actually also provide them with certain like medical treatments. Almost all of the world's catfish and trout, well, at least that are eaten in the United States anyway, are raised this way through aquaculture. Critics of aquaculture point out, though, that it can really become and create more environmental problems than it's really worth. In a typical aquaculture facility, clean water is pumped in at one end of the pond and then it's pumped out into the marine ecosystem, usually as wastewater. So that wastewater contains feces and uneaten food and, of course, antibiotics, and we're pumping all that stuff out into the river system or the ocean system. And all that wastewater contains like bacteria and viruses, and it's also a high density nutrient-rich water. And so they just think that overall, aquaculture, even though it has some promising characteristics, does it mean sustainable food production? Over the next series of slides, I'm just going to show you some fishing data. So over the years, 1960 to 2000, the catch per 100 hooks or 100 lineouts has drastically decreased within that time period. When we're talking millions of fish over the course of a year, we're looking at a slightly different line. How many millions of fish are being caught over the course of the year? You can see here that this is just really not, there's no nice trend to this. We see the 1960s, 1970s crash, and then we see an upheaval here recently. So this is what a graph would look like if a fishery was recovering after a crash. And when it comes to feeding the world, here we can talk about how wild-caught and farmed-raised fish production has basically met world production of fish through millions of metric tons per kilogram per year. So from 1950 to 2010, farmed-raised fish have increased drastically, where wild-caught fish are doing this like plateau or even small decline. So, in conclusion here, alternatives to modern industrial agriculture feature a number of different characteristics that tend to imitate this natural process. Intercropping of different plants are similar to multi-species association of plants that exist in nature. Crop rotation is a practice that stimulates the natural shifts in the environment, and integrated pest management uses a variety of techniques to control pests with minimum pesticide use. So organic agriculture is the production of these crops where synthetic pesticides and fertilizers are not used. So overall, when we talk about this, the U.S. government, how it subsidizes aquaculture or fisheries, what do you think about that? What do you think about fish farming in the ocean? Should we or should we not? Is it relevant? What are the environmental pros and cons of fish farming in the ocean? Do you think that fish farming in the ocean is even a good idea? How does it impact the environment of fish farming in the ocean versus the natural system? So the economics behind all of this is what we'll talk about next.